Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining Rachel and me today, this evening, afternoon, maybe it's the morning, depending on where you're listening from. We're honored to have you here. And we are going to be speaking to a wonderful topic. We've been doing sacred conversations. I think this is our fourth installment. And in our sacred conversations, Rachel and I like to bring a topic forward that we find interesting and of value. And we felt that the topic around grief felt really called to both of us. And now more than ever, I think, with where we've been as a society since the beginning of the year, it's a great topic to speak to. And we're excited to share with you.
It's timely.
All
It was
right.
funny. I just have to throw in a little funny before we start. So I think it was the very same day you had sent me your idea for this potential title for a sacred conversation of good grief. And I was in the car with my toddler, and he has a Charlie Brown book that has these buttons and Snoopy down the side that you can push, and they make the different sounds. Um, and he was over and over in the back pushing the Charlie Brown button that says, "Good grief, good grief." And I was like, well, this is going to happen. This is supposed to happen.
Oh, and maybe by the end of this conversation, you might feel the sense that, grief is deeply valuable as it being human. And so, I think it's quite good, so to say, as part of just living the full human experience. All right, so I'd love to dive in and just talk about a couple of resources first. I'm going to be sharing some information. I know Rachel will be too. And I just wanted to give a shout out to the two people that I've cited quite a bit through where I've kind of pulled some information from to share. And I will add this in the notes, so you'll be able to watch this back on YouTube, and in our show notes, you'll see citations to these two authors. And one is a gentleman by the name of Francis Weller. He's written this book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, that both Rachel and I find quite delicious, book twins. So there's some wonderful information that we'll be bringing forward from him. And his writing is quite poetic and beautiful around this topic. So even if you feel that grief isn't so good, the way he speaks to it is quite lovely. And then the second gentleman, and if for some reason he ever listens to this, I apologize if I'm saying your last name wrong, but his name is Antonio Sausys. And he writes, I saw him at a yoga conference, and he writes a book, Yoga for Grief Relief. And I'm also going to be sharing some of, his citations as well. So I'll be dropping both of those into the show notes. And Rachel, was there anything else on your end, or was it mostly Weller?
You know, um, yeah, I love this book. It's not specifically about grief, but it's by Elizabeth Lesser, who's the co-founder of the Omega Institute. And I read it years ago. I haven't reread it recently, but I just remember how supportive it was for me during a time of grief and loss. How difficult times can help us grow.
Wonderful. So we'll share those three bits with you, and there's plenty more. So this idea of grief, there's a couple things I want to point to just to normalize it, and that is it's a natural response to loss and to any loss. So for some of us, we might think of grieving as bereavement and potentially the loss of life, but we can feel a sense of grief beyond death, and that might be careers or relationships, the loss of prized possessions. Maybe you're moving, a change in residence, so a change in your immediate community. You can grieve and have a sense of loss around certain times of your life, or the health of your body and mind as well. And then, on a different note, you can grieve the end of a book series or a movie series or a TV series that you find particularly enjoyable, or you feel a sense of attachment to. So it's important to know that grief is universal, but yet how we will experience our grief will be really unique. And so I just want to let you know from one griever potentially to another that you're not alone.
I think that's one of the most powerful points, in any sort of birthing experience that we find ourselves in, is to remember that we are not alone. Generations of humans have gone through these rites of passage, these processes and they're part of, like you said, human development in a lifespan, and they're part of our maturing and individuation while we have life on the planet. So they can often feel like really alone experiences, but that is just not the truth.
No, and the recognition that it's a normal response to a loss, whatever that loss may be. And that, for many of us, it'll affect us and touch us in many different ways. Some people might experience some physical or mental, emotional, or spiritual. Um, I use the word symptoms lightly, but just different experiences around grief. And one thing that was deeply helpful for me is this recognition that I will never get over a deep grief that I have and a deep loss that I've experienced early on in my life. But I certainly will be able to transform my relationship with it. So that might be also a bit of peace of mind. You can often hear like the different stages of grief that you move through, and at the end there's this acceptance. And I don't think for some of us we truly accept the loss, but it's more accepting how we are kind of reacting to that loss and finding a new way to kind of, as Francis Weller puts it, have an apprenticeship with this grief and loss. So we're not looking to get rid of grief and loss. We're looking to have maybe a different relationship or transform our relationship to it.
And part of that is welcoming, acknowledging and welcoming how we are changed by our losses. Yeah. Often I think in a loss we lose some part of our identity that was um, wrapped up in that person or that thing, or that experience, that way of knowing ourselves. And so part of what's lost is our identity. And we learn it's not that, but the beautiful and miraculous thing is we go on being in spite of the loss, right? We go on being. So then there's just this really unique opportunity to learn ourselves in a new way. And that can be vulnerable and tender for a little while as we learn who we are with that loss becoming integrated.
And what would you say some of those defining characteristics of that kind of process might be?
Um, well, what comes to mind first is just a real felt sense of vulnerability, right? Because often our identity, the one identity we've built over years or that's been handed to us by our family or our culture, it's a bit of a protection, right? It's a wall in a sense. It's a defense, our identity is. So to lose part of an identity crumbles a bit of the wall and we find ourselves a bit vulnerable. So there can be the experience of feeling raw or open or a little too open, uncertain. There's a bit of an unknown there because now we're entering we're becoming a person we don't yet know ourselves as. So it's just feels really vulnerable to me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I speaking from a little personal experience, not getting into the whole story of it all, but growing up in a household where my mother was an alcoholic, and there was a deep codependency that we had created, and it was a hard thing to separate where she ended and I began. I mean, we had this dance of codependency in our relationship, and at the end of that relationship and the tie being cut and that loss, I deeply resonate with what you're saying. There was a good 5 years where I had no idea who I was without her, without being her caregiver and her support person. And it did take a good amount of time and me navigating uncharted waters, and it was, deeply unsettling for a period of time. Yeah. So I'd like to maybe move in and touch just briefly on this idea of grief and loss, and recognizing that there is, and this comes from Sausys writing, that there's like an initial loss and then kind of a secondary loss or grief. And the initial grief or loss is like what occurs first, and it occurs once. So it might be that initial death, or physically moving your location where you're living to another place, the loss of a job, or the loss of a relationship, or the ending of a relationship. And so that's kind of this initial grief plate we've been offered to digest. And then what comes after that is what he's talking about is a secondary loss. And that's a result of that initial loss. And what I love that he says, because I felt this to be true so much in my experience, is it tends to be a bit more subtle. And there's a lot of possibility for reoccurrence or kind of triggering of that grief. And a lot of times it can be unacknowledged. And so that concept of, somebody passed away and it's been X amount of years, like, haven't you accepted it yet? And we might have a relationship around that initial moment of loss. But, each time that reoccurrence comes up, or that a little bit of a trigger to grief, for an example, again, just speaking from my experience, having to grieve my mother, the fact that she wasn't there on my wedding day, or if I choose to have children. So these moments where you might want to reach out and have that, what was lost, it kind of is that secondary grief that comes around, and it will have varying intensities. Sometimes it'll be deeply emotionally intense, and other times it's just kind of a little blip on the map, so to say.
Yeah, I can speak to that as well. I remember traveling to locations where my ex-husband and I had vacationed, after divorce, and just being, and even several years after, and being so stunned at the way that memories and pain would surface over feeling the loss of that life. Um, and what I kind of want to say there is, our ego and our conscious mind tracks time in a linear way. It's like, well, that happened then, and now it's now. But the body and the psyche, which we can also call the soul, are non-linear. So they're multidimensional. It's like it's all collapsed on top of each other. So, when you hit one of those nerve bundles that has a grief trigger in it, it doesn't matter how long it's been. It's like it was yesterday. And that's all just very normal and not easy necessarily, but Jenny Shay and I will hopefully get to that part where we can offer a little bit of support for what happens, what to do when the grief waves come.
Yes.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to just touch on, because we're kind of dancing around it without calling it what it is, but this idea about grief and there being a bit of a root here, and I think to point to this attachment as being a bit of a root to our grief. And
And
we
it's a
can,
great thing. Like,
yeah,
it's human. It's all mammals become attached, We're built to have an attachment bond with our caregivers and our families and our communities, and even our role within the community.
hardwired.
It's hardwired into all mammal species. Yeah. So attachment, in the spiritual community is sometimes looked at negatively, like you're not supposed to be attached. Attachment's the source of pain. Well, yes, it is. And you're also human and designed to attach. So good luck with that, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's healthy to attach. Attachment theory is well and alive in, in how we learn how to parent and be in relationships. It's a big part of healthy relationships.
Yeah, how we feel at home, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Mm.
So
Mm.
I'm feeling maybe moving into the gates, the five
Yeah.
gates of grief from Weller, if that feels right for you in the moment.
I want to say one thing
Yeah.
before we do that. And Weller points this out so beautifully, and I found it so powerful when I was reading his book. But he really says that we're in a culture that under acknowledges grief in here in the West, and particularly in the US. And what we see as a result of that, so there's this reservoir, collective reservoir, like that's subterranean, beneath the surface in our culture, this reservoir of grief that's not tapped. We don't touch it. We don't move in there with it and befriend it and welcome it and feel it and let it move. And so as a result, what we have are these occasional geysers of violence, right? So he points to school shootings, um, all sorts of, also the epidemics of depression, and in our society, the mass medication of mood disorders. He points to all that as our unwillingness, partly unwillingness, also our, we just haven't been taught how to meet our grief, and that it's valid and that it deserves to be touched. And that if we would get more comfortable with our grief, those other things we would see, those residues of untouched grief would dissipate a bit. But it's not easy. We're not taught in this culture how to do that.
No, no. I certainly had no grief support or knowing of grief and how to work with, loss and that discomfort early on until, you seek out teachers or support or allies or techniques, and you're trying on what feels right in the moment for you to digest some of this undigested experiences. Yeah. Before we get to the five gates, just because you talked about residues, I want to just share a couple common residues just so we can see how common it is and how some of our residues or symptoms that we might be presenting, how they could be pointing us to just unresolved, digested sorrow and grief. Um, and this can be a physical, mental, or kind of social. So I'll touch on just a couple in each, and then we'll kind of open up into the five gates, which is quite lovely. Uh, so just to give you an idea, some physical residues that might be lingering or expressions of unresolved grief and pain, sorrow, is physical pain. Think about the epidemic also of chronic pain. I know many people with chronic pain. My dad is one of them, some of my family members. So pain, tightness in the chest, the throat, the abdomen. When you have alterations in your breathing pattern, your sleep patterns, your digestive patterns, cardiac rhythm, these are, fatigue. These can all be pointers of residue kind of lingering in this part of our body. In our mental body, we can have a sense of confusion or absent-mindedness, being very forgetful, poor concentration or lack of motivation, a sense of denial. And then socially, there could be a bit of this need to withdraw, isolation. The things that you once enjoyed, you no longer get that same sweetness from. And then also learning to cope with certain labels that we might give certain people around grief or loss, like widow or single or divorcee. And I also find that with social interactions, it might also be a bit of like recycling friends quite quickly. It's almost like you're looking for some sense of attachment and love that you're missing, and you can kind of go through relationships rather superficially. So these can be, ways that these residues show and display itself through the various bodies that make us beings and who we are. All right, so is it the five gates time?
Yeah. And just to clarify again, this is what Weller, Francis Weller, in his book The Wild Edge of Sorrow, these are what he calls the like the gateways into the rite of passage that is grief. These are the doorways into that experience. Um, yeah, and so I'll just go ahead and start, I
Yeah, you
guess.
want to go on?
Because the first one's the one we all think of, which is what you mentioned at the beginning, is bereavement. You know, just this truth of impermanence, that everything we love we will lose at some point. Either that thing will go away or we will. And so that's the first gate, is everything we love we will lose. And that's the gate that we're all most familiar with and think of when we think of grief.
And our second gate, oh, so tender, but this one is the places that have not known love. So these are the parts of ourselves that we've denied or feel ashamed about or we've resisted. It's been outside our circle of worth. So it's untouched by our love, our compassion, and kindness. So the places that, have not known love.
And we may not see those places until some experiences brings them up into our face, and we realize, oh goodness, I don't like that part of myself. I never have. I've been hating that. No one else has ever loved that. Yeah, that place has not known love.
Mm.
Yeah, I think of this too a lot with a lot of the inner child work that we do now in the world of somatics and psychology. That little person that didn't get exactly what they needed when they were little. Yeah.
Yeah, neglect, right?
Mm. And it might not have been overt, but perhaps the resources were just spread a little thin, and the caregiver couldn't quite deliver what the child was really needing in the moment. Yeah. Yeah, so the third gate is more collective. It's the sorrows of the world. And I think probably we're all feeling that in this time with everything that's going on, from the pandemic to violence to um, global change on the planet, destruction of our beautiful resources, natural resources. So sometimes what we're feeling is not personal, and especially if you're a highly sensitive person or an empath, um, you may be feeling more of the collective grief. And in depth psychology and eco psychology, we even say that the earth herself, like the body of the earth known as Gaia, that she can grieve. And so you can feel her grief expressing through you. And, this may be times when you're like, man, I feel so sad or so heavy and I don't know why. Or I remember having a cathartic experience once where there was an expression of grief and I was just so clear, this is more than just me. This is more than just me.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Sometimes it's, this is a little more subtle, but depending on the types of, healing work you do, you might be feeling the grief of your lineage, of your heritage, right? Or of all the women in the world through time. It can be sort of archetypal in that way with your family or your, um, yeah.
I find this one deeply interesting, doing certain practices with people. I was doing some body work for a period of time, and on occasion I'd wake up and feel out of sorts, like just like something didn't feel right, like I was out of my skin almost. And then the person that I was seeing would come that day and share, what brought them in today. And it's almost like this big yes came into my body, like, oh, I was in a way not necessarily anticipating, but already kind of connecting into the sense of resonance with this person that will be coming later, and already feeling some of that weight or that grief that they were experiencing. And also, I just want to speak because you mentioned Gaia and the earth. In one of my books that I was reading when I was studying aromatherapy and essential oils, there's a book on the energetic. So it's a bit more of the subtle realm of plants. And there were accounts of people that are highly sensitive people or empaths that would literally hear the forest crying during deforestation.
Wow.
And even just thinking about it, I get this chill because I think those that are really attuned to the earth get a sense like, oh, there's something not right here. And the earth really is letting us know that there's something deeply not okay.
Yeah. And I think you guys, with the fires in California right now, you know, you get to see and feel that very close to home.
Mm-hmm. Gate 4. This one is really juicy for me. What we expected and did not receive. So what we expected and did not receive. So these are things that we may not even realize that we've lost. How do we know what we've missed if we've never had it? So only when these things are finally granted to us, a wave of recognition can rise up in us that we've lived without this love or this tenderness for periods of our life or possibly our whole life. I remember in the IREST training, level 1, after the first session, sitting up and feeling this sense of belonging to myself that I really never touched into, and then recognizing, oh my gosh, it's been here all along, but somehow I missed it. I didn't quite access it until this moment. And I remember describing that whole level 1 training as it was bittersweet. It was kind of paradoxical, right? To have this recognition, but also like, oh, and I need to grieve that, like, this time I've, this first 25 years of life that I've missed this. Yeah.
In gate 5, ancestral grief, which I guess I sort of mentioned in gate 3. Gate 3 is the sorrows of the world. And gate 5 is ancestral. So, knowing more specifically what's happened in your lineage can help you understand and process feelings of grief. Yeah.
And something that Weller says around this gate that I loved, he said, this sorrow becomes concentrated over time, gathering grief unto itself, and is carried in our psyche unconsciously, this part, as a diminished inheritance. I've been reading some Jewish lore to get me in touch with my ancestors because I never had a sense of that in my life growing up. And so reading some of these period pieces and how women, how we had navigated the world of being a woman now, and just like, oh man, like feeling a little bit of that ancestral pull of, wow, that must have been super challenging. And also many of us, our ancestors migrated all around. So at some point they left their home, they left their community, their shelter, their safe space to come to a new land. And when we talked about that loss and that fear, right, of losing identity, imagine maybe we haven't had that experience, but at some point our ancestors absolutely must have, or to have their home taken away from them.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right there. Well, what we wanted to do next, shall we head into the self-inquiry and reflection?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So that's, sort of the package, roughly, loosely, lightly, of what grief, how we see grief and how it may show up for any one of us. So we want to bring this a little closer to home with some self-inquiry questions, and then offer a few tools. And this is, we're not even touching the tip of the iceberg with this conversation, but hopefully there'll be some opportunities in the future for us to dive a little deeper. Yeah. So as you're considering for yourself how you've processed grief in your life, it's good to look at the culture you grew up in and ask yourself how, really look at where did you grow up, what was the culture, and how did your culture acknowledge grief? What rituals did they offer you? What tools? What conversation? around events of loss or bereavement. For example, in my culture, the culture I grew up in, which I think is pretty standard North America, there was a funeral, and that was that. That was that. And
Right? It's like a couple hours, all done, go about your normal life.
while no one's really going about their normal life, but it's not
Absolutely.
being talked about, and it's not being openly mourned, like in a lot of the sacred texts or indigenous tribes, there were days and dances and prayers and everyone together and around the fire and storytelling and drumming and all these cathartic expressions for a long period of time. And that's not how our culture currently handles bereavement. Yeah. And that's death, much less talking about divorce or job loss or moving across country.
Right.
We don't touch those things at all with ritual or ceremony or support, except one on one in a therapy session, perhaps.
Well, and
So,
that,
ask yourself how your culture handled grief as you were growing up.
another question that I found really interesting, and this revolves more around the loss of life, is was there was it always an out of the house experience? So were people dying in like hospice care facilities or at hospitals, or was there a sense of bringing it home and having that sacred time at home? That might be another question to kind of dive into.
I kind of mentioned this one already, but to be more specific, what death and dying rituals did your culture provide?
I think another one that is a bit important is if you grew up in a large household, or were you like an only child, or was it a small nuclear family, so to say? Like, what was that family support like in the immediate home? That can, wake up a lot of feelings of isolation and feeling like you're left alone if you didn't live with grandma and grandpa and sisters and cousins. It was just, you and one parent or you and both parents, and loss of a parent, it can feel like that's a third of my immediate home that is, now no longer here.
And what were the conversations around loss and death as I was growing up? Were there any? How were my own losses as a child? Maybe my small losses, like smaller.
Like your goldfish.
Yeah, how was that held? Mhm. Deep breath
Yeah.
in the nose and out the mouth. So we really want to close or wrap up by offering a pointer to a few tools that Denny Shea and I are familiar with and love.
Yes. I will say, because I cited Antonio quite a bit, that he does say very specifically, like, this book is not to get rid of your grief. It's not going to take it away. It's about relief. So he's compiled some beautiful practices around movement and breathing and linking them and intention to bring some relief to some of those residues that we mentioned a little bit earlier. So his resource is wonderful for that, but there's plenty of other practitioners that are offering, movement and breathing and yoga or yoga-like practices around grief and or trauma. Sometimes, there's not unfortunately, a lot of studies around grief, but there's a ton of studies on trauma, and sometimes they're very intimately linked. And so his focus is primarily more on grief. So I've enjoyed some of his practices and have brought them forward in certain groups that, wasn't a grief group. It was just a regular public group, but we've all experienced loss. So I knew that these movement or breathing practices might be very beneficial.
So movement and breathing. A second tool that Denise and I both love as certified IREST teachers is the IREST meditation. And, you know, it's hand in glove with what you just said about what Antonio says, that this is not to get rid of your grief, right? Because in IREST, we're acknowledging I'm never trying to get rid of a part of my experience. What I am learning to do is how to hold it so that that is integrated and I know myself as a whole that contains that part of my experience. I like the image of the guest house, you know, Rumi's poem, The Guest House, comes in here. So with IREST practice, we're learning how to experience ourselves as the guest house and to how to allow and be with and befriend this visitor or guest of grief that may come and go. And may come and go, will come and go actually our whole lives. There's not a
Absolutely.
point where we won't have this experience.
And there might be other, you know, meditative or self-inquiry tools that might reflect a lot of the similar principles, but I know Rachel and myself have really steeped in the IREST protocols and how that's being shared now. And so, yeah, it's how I meet myself. And as I was saying, that first initial training in IREST really opened me up wide to the whole experience I was having in my life. And at that time, it was a lot of the sorrow and the loss. So can't say enough about IREST. I always say that it saved my life in a way. So it's a wonderful way of being with yourself. I'm going to throw a little curveball in and mention briefly essential oils. And there's also this idea of sound. And why I'm bringing up these two sensory type of modalities or therapies is because grief, loss, and sorrow will really pull on the energy body, and you'll feel in a way, you know, from that fatigue and low energy, your frequency is getting a bit dim. It's dimmed out. Think about the felt sense of loss and grief. It might feel really heavy, right? Or maybe dark, like it has some of those qualities about it. And so big essential oil fan. It's a big part of my practice. And I will say from my studies and knowing what it's doing to the energetic field in terms of the frequency, the high vibrational tones and qualities of rich, pure, authentic essential oils that have been distilled and harvested with love and tenderness. These can, in a way, be like supplementation for the energy body. So it helps to bring up the frequency that we're emitting. And so it can begin to very subtly in the background soften and lighten that load. And same with sound. I'm not as versed in sound, but just from a recent class I was watching and listening into, the sound waves and the resonance can also kind of disrupt that heavy, tight, contracted energy body in the experience of loss and grief. So sensory therapies, mentioning, you know, smell and sound, but, you know, we can also get into massage. I think all sensory therapies have the power to reorganize disorganized energy. So I just wanted to throw that one in there.
I'm so glad you brought that up. It's a great to say it too. Yeah. Seek an ally. And this could be, you know, a human ally in the form of a therapist or coach or Reiki practitioner or aromatherapist. But I also, because of the depth psychology and eco-psychology background, I like to always mention that an ally can be non-physical. So, you know, it could be an ancestor, a grandparent that you had a close connection to that has now passed. It could be the idea of spirit. It could even be in the natural world. I know I have a tree in my backyard that is often my ally, you know. So be open and be curious about the images and the people that come to you when you're daydreaming or dreaming at night, or in your meditations. or just in the day, if someone, an ancestor or an image pops into your mind's eye, pay attention, because those can be allies that we can, talk to and really meditate with, and help. They can help us have perspective and wisdom and guidance. Yeah.
And I want to piggyback on that because it's something we mentioned previously in the talk about the sense of feeling at home. So I know I use totems a lot of times. Like there were certain items that, for instance, were my mother's that, there's a shirt that I love to wear that's hers, or a piece of jewelry that it's like when I put it on, it's like this sense of connection and home. And it does truly feel like a little life vest or a life preserver. Like, oh, you can like lean back into it and just feel like deeply at home. Yeah. And then lastly, we don't have super specifics that we'll be sharing potentially in the coming sessions that we might be offering, but the idea of having a grief ritual and or making time for the grief. That's something new I've been working with is, setting a 5-minute timer a couple times a week just to kind of like get on the floor, because that's what feels at home for me, and just like, okay, here I am, like honoring that it wants to be felt and connected to. And so for me, a grief ritual that I've been working with is lighting a candle, laying on the ground, and just saying, you're welcome here, and having this 5 minutes to yell, to cry, to laugh, to journal, just to like give my full unbridled attention and love, like it's my best friend coming to see me, and just going yes with open hands and an open heart.
That reminds me cliche of what Weller says about we always want to meet our grief from our adult self. And I can't remember exactly how he says that, but that the child in us meeting our grief can become overwhelmed or fused with it. So we are meeting our grief from that adult place that can be compassionate and loving, but that's not like identified with it. So that's exactly what I hear you say you're doing.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. And often my 7 and 8-year-old comes in full of rage and sorrow, and I'm like, hi, baby girl, like I'm your ally. I'm your inner resource. I'm bathed in oil. There's like all these beautiful components that go along with that. Yeah. It's certainly not me like I'm 7 and 8 and going into that, because that might be
Terrorizing and
yeah,
traumatizing, right?
exactly.
Yeah. And I love, there's so many possibilities for grief rituals, like you said, Denny Shea. Francis Weller, he's a psychologist, and he started seeing enough people with enough grief that he became an expert in grief, and he offers grief rituals and grief retreats actually all around the world with the specific intention of holding space over a matter of days for people to begin to welcome and move and then integrate their unexpressed grief. So that's just such a really beautiful thing, I think, in our culture that doesn't have any support like that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And yeah, sorry, is there anything else before we wrap up? I just had a thought, kind of
No,
a
no,
wrap up thought though. So
no,
I don't know if
share.
we're ready to wrap up
Yeah, yeah.
for now. Um, it's this idea that we live in, and Weller talks about this, but we live in a culture that values things looking bright and beautiful, and sort of the outside being pretty. And that's an energetic movement of ascent. We like the upward movement, and grief is a downward movement. It's a movement of descent, and it brings us back close to the earth. You think about decay and death, and things composting. So we don't value that. But this is what I wanted to close with is Denny Shea and I see that as sacred, and hence the name of our joint venture, Sacred Earth, right? So we really are wanting to bring light to the understanding that every part of the experience, also the deep, dark ones, are very sacred and are opportunities for spiritual experience, really. Yeah.
Part of being human.
which is spiritual and sacred.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
Well, thank you, friend, and thank you for those here and those that will be listening back on our recordings. We share this with love and we share from our own experience. So do feel free to reach out to us anytime that you need. If you have questions, you want to know a bit more, maybe about some of what we're speaking to, I will add our 3 books that we mentioned in the beginning into the notes. That way you might buy them and read them. And I highlight like almost everything Weller writes in his book. And, really, as he says, become an apprentice to some of these parts of ourselves that maybe we haven't quite welcomed in as fully as, like you were saying, the kindness and the love and some of those ascending
Yeah.
parts of ourselves. Yeah.
And stay tuned. So you can follow us on Instagram. You can also go to our website, sacredearthretreats.com, and sign up for our newsletter, and that will keep you apprised of any online or in person, when it's possible again, any events or workshops that we offer. In the meantime, because we're not currently offering any in-person events, we're doing this monthly, Zoom classroom offering. But in the meantime, if you're interested more deeply in what Denny Shea and I have shared on this, you can find out each of our individual offerings as practitioners at our websites. And yours is
Yep.
givingtreeessentials.com,
Mm-hmm.
givingtreeessentials.com, and mine is breatheatheal.com, breatheatheal.com. And we're both available currently on an individual private client basis. So, and we're here to support. Yeah. So thank you for being with me, Denny Shea. And thanks to those of you who are joining now and later. Yeah.
You take care. We'll
Yes,
see you
sir.
next month. We'll be doing some poetry, sharing some poetry and tea. And that information's on the website, so you can hit the registration link and you'll get your reminders right before. I believe it's the 25th, so it's the last Friday of the month at 3 p.m. Pacific time, 5 p.m. Central time, and we'll share some beautiful poetry.
Thanks much. Bye.
Bye.